everyone, and welcome to my ultra procrastination video. Why is this called the ultra procrastination video, you may ask? Well, there are a couple of different reasons. Number one is I absolutely procrastinated on the making of this video. School is wrapping up and I find myself not wanting to do much else other than just sort of lie in my bed and think about the slow, sweet release of summer. I had to there, didn't I? Yeah, I'm looking forward to summer as much as anybody since I'm finally going to get that second microchip installed in my arm. That will allow me to exit the house and do some things outside and in a place other than my very small room, which is currently very messy. Be glad you can't see that. So yeah, I procrastinated on making this video, and also I am totally using this video to procrastinate on my actual homework, which I should be doing. But you know what's better than homework? Books. As you may recall, March was a less than optimal reading month for yours truly. I only got through about 4 different books and I didn't really enjoy, okay, that's the wrong word. I didn't love any of them. This month, in quantity, was a much better reading month. I read about 7 books in the month of April. In quality, though, we'll get to that. Book number 1 that I read in April was a book that I read for one of my book clubs, and that was The Red Notebook by Antoine. It was translated into English from French by Emily Boyce and Jane Aitken, and I don't really have a whole lot to say about the translation. I thought that in places the wording seemed a little bit stilted and unlike what it would be in English, but it's hard to say at times whether that's the product of a source text or of the actual translation. I thought for the most part the translation was fine. So let's get to the actual story. When I picked this up, I didn't know much about it. I knew that it was a bookish romance set in France, in Paris, lots of literary references, lots of banter apparently, and I was like, oh, this is great. This is like my heart put on a plate, if that plate were actually a book. You know what I'm saying, right? So I really thought I was going to love this book, and then I started reading it, and then I was like, I hate this book. So the central premise of the book is that these 2 people named Laurain and Laure, total Hans Christian Andersen stuff here, am I right? So these 2 strangers are brought together in a way by Laure, the woman's discarded handbag. She's held up when she's outside one day and she is able to get her handbag away from the thief, but she injures herself and ends up going into a coma. She goes to the hospital, but she leaves her bag behind, and Laurain, who is a bookseller in Paris, ends up finding it, realizes that it belongs to a woman, and starts to fall in love with her based on the contents of her handbag. He also ends up going into her apartment without really anybody knowing, or when they do know, they think that he knows her better than he does, which is not at all. And otherwise, like, rummaging through the contents of her handbag in a way that could be perceived as a little bit creepy, and at times I did. But that really wasn't the reason that I was sort of uneasy reading this book. I just thought it was a really weirdly constructed situation. That this woman apparently carries around artifacts from her childhood constantly in this handbag, and that's never really explained whether she does that all the time or there's like a specific reason that she was transporting so many things that would conveniently allow a lonely bookseller to somehow fall in love with her because they know so much about her past. Also I was expecting to, even though the situation was kind of oddly constructed and weird, I was at least expecting to sort of, I guess, become interested in Laure along with Laurain. I was hoping to really get a glimpse of her as a person, the way that he seemed to from the things in her handbag, and honestly, she seemed pretty bland. She seemed like a very prototypical female love interest, like, oh, I read books. Do other women read books? No, there's not a single woman in the entire city of Paris that reads the books just like I do. I must be pretty darn special. And also she wrote down things in her journal that seemed like super insightful, but honestly kind of came off as somebody who'd been reading John Green a few too many times and was just like, oh, have you ever thought about life and how, like, we're alive? Isn't that amazing? So yeah, I honestly wasn't as into the romance as I think many other people were reading the book. Almost all of the side characters also were very two-dimensional. They were basically there to be the girlfriend who's clearly not right for the male protagonist, or the gay best friend who's there to more or less be support for the female protagonist, but not to be a romantic threat because, as we've said, he's gay. I did end up liking a couple of the side characters in this book by the end, but it took me a really long time. Even so, like, as much as I've already kind of complained about this book, I did find myself getting kind of invested in it by the end. I liked that these two people are not super young. One of them has a teenage daughter, and the other's spouse died relatively young, and so this is sort of like a second chance for both of them. And I was really hoping that they were going to be able to get that chance. By close to the end of the book, I began to be attached to their situation, if not so much to the characters themselves. But because the book is so short and I spent so much of it wondering if I was even going to be able to finish it, I really can't justify giving it more than, let's say, 2.5 stars. It was a good rainy day book, you know, on a day like today. You could take it out, read it for an afternoon, have some fun with it, but don't expect it to stick with you for too much longer than that. Next book I read was another short, quick read. This one I enjoyed somewhat more, but I unfortunately had some issues with it that I will get to, and that was Vinegar Girl by Anne Tyler. If you've watched my Shakespeare retellings video I made a couple of weeks back, I've already discussed this book a little bit. But to recap, it is a retelling of The Taming of the Shrew, which is a play by Shakespeare that I saw at a very young age and immediately became angrier than I had ever been in my entire life. For those who aren't familiar with The Taming of the Shrew, it is basically a play about this woman who is very headstrong and stubborn and kind of forward-thinking in a time when that was really uncomfortable for a woman to be like that, and she's constantly compared to a younger sister who's very beautiful and outgoing and who everybody loves. And the entire plot of the book is trying to get the older sister married off so the younger sister can be married, and she basically gets traded to this guy who's only in it for the money and decides that he is going to tame her, and he basically like starves her and effectively like tortures her for a long period of time and browbeats her into sort of being this submissive woman. And it's supposed to be a comedy, which is like absolutely disgusting, and if you think otherwise, then you should leave. Well, actually, let me clarify that a little bit. There are interpretations of the play that do suggest that perhaps this is meant to be a kind of social commentary about the treatment of women, and you can produce the play in that way, but a lot of the time it isn't produced in that way, and when it isn't, it really makes me physically ill. This retelling, I think, for a lot of the book, did a pretty good job of modernizing the story and making it palatable while maintaining the story. The protagonist is still the headstrong daughter who is named Kate Batista in this retelling. She went to college when she was younger, had to drop out. She mouthed off a few too many times to her professors. And to be honest with you, okay, let me level with you for a second. This is something I didn't really buy in the book, that she was kicked out of college because she called out a professor because she thought they were wrong. Like, I mean, if she totally cussed them out, that'd be one thing, but the book just kind of makes it out like she called them a couple of names and she was kicked out of school, and her dad was even on her side. Like, I can understand that happening in like 1920, but this is supposed to be set in like the 2000s. Like, I don't think women get kicked out of college for having opinions anymore. I hope. If you know of any instances of this happening, I don't know whether I want you to tell me in the comments or not. I'm kind of leaning toward not at this point, because I don't think I can handle that today. But anyway, going back to the story, it's in this version, the marriage that's being arranged is actually a green card marriage. Her father is a professor and his research assistant is from another country. It seems Slavic-ish. It's never quite clarified where he's from, but he needs to stay in the country, and so Kate's dad says, hey, can you please marry this guy? I promise it won't be for long. I thought the story was well written. It's a nice examination of sort of middle-class American life. It's Jane Austen-like in that it is sort of a sly satire, but it's a bit gentler, I think. It's not quite as barbed, although it does occasionally have some very funny one-liners and asides. I really like the character of Kate in this. I think that she's appropriately stubborn and headstrong and maybe a little socially awkward, but still very likable. Also, the love interest in this, Pyotr, he's interesting because he's a lot more of just like a himbo. He is really kind of into Kate, and he likes her stubbornness and her forthrightness, and he's actually kind of cute in this version. The reason that I'm only giving this 3 stars is because I felt that A, it was a little bit too short. I really wanted to see more of their relationship develop, and B, if you know the original play, then you also know the ending of the play, and the way that this book decided to end the story, I was not a huge fan. I thought it hewed a bit too close to the original in a way that didn't translate well for a modern audience. It seemed like it was trying to be feminist, but like wasn't. I don't know. I don't want to spoil things for anybody. I would still recommend this book because I did have a lot of fun reading it, and I think it's well written and mostly well done, but because of that ending, I just can't super enthusiastically recommend it. I can just say, that was cute. It will probably make you scream less than the original play, so give it a try. I'm going to talk about these two together. They are volumes 1 and 2 of the comic Sleepless, written by Sarah Vaughn with illustrations by Leila del Duca. First book is about a monarchy in which there is this coalition of guards who never sleep, who take care of the royal family, and when they take their vows, they're basically saying, I will never sleep again. And the young princess, whose father has recently passed away and whose mother is in a distant kingdom, is being taken care of by this one specific guy, who, it's very heavily implied early on, is quite in love with her. Whether or not she feels the same way, it takes a little bit longer to see that part. When I read this first volume, I gave it like 3.5 stars. I thought it was a really interesting world and an interesting concept to have these guards who never sleep. I also like some of the mythological details around this world, such as what happens to guards who do fall asleep, who aren't able to stave off the constant nightmares that result in not having enough sleep, because that's really bad for you, obviously. We're shown some of the fates of those nights, and it's really sobering and scary to see. I also like the magic system in this book. The country that the princess is from is known for their healers and their healing abilities, but there's a catch to it. The healing a person takes time out of their life, whatever time would have been used to heal it, and so fast healing is usually reserved for injuries that are not life-threatening but that will take a very long time to heal on their own. But if you try to heal a life-threatening injury immediately with magic, then that can actually result in killing the person. Those were both really interesting. I like some of the side characters as well. Poppy has a cousin who is initially a bit standoffish to her. She has a scarred face, and so she is not incredibly popular at the court, but you eventually warm up to her, and I really was interested in her story and her as a person. There was a little bit of a cliffhanger, but it left me excited to read the next book. However, when I got to the second one, I realized that I had mostly liked the first one as a setup for a longer series, and that the second book was the only other book we were going to get, and then we're done, no more. And the second book just didn't answer enough of the questions that the first one raised for me to really enjoy it. Although the tension between the two main characters in the second book is done really well at the beginning, it starts to get kind of garbled near the end. The plot just gets really mishmashed. It's hard to tell who we're supposed to like and who we're supposed to not like. People's motivations aren't fleshed out very well. When we finally discover like the culprit of the whole situation that's been taking place over these two books, it's delivered to us in sort of an info dump, and so it just doesn't have the impact that it really should have. We also hardly see any of the characters that I really liked, and we don't get much more backstory about the two main characters either. I was really hoping for more on their story before book 1 starts, but no. I do really like that these books have a diverse cast. It's nice to see a fantasy that isn't just all white people, that actually sort of mirrors what a diverse kingdom might look like. And I do like a lot of things about these books, but unfortunately I just can't really heartily recommend them. I would give the second one 2 stars, honestly. I'm wondering if there was some sort of creative issue or a problem with money, and that's why this series couldn't continue. I honestly can't figure out what happened, but unfortunately it did happen, so sorry. Next up is another book I've mentioned once or twice before, which is Super Fake Love Song by David Yoon. I read Frankly in Love by David Yoon last year, and I did enjoy it. I had some problems with it, but the good stuff was so good that I really wanted to try his other book. I found that this book was a bit more, I guess, consistent than Frankly in Love. I felt that the bad stuff wasn't quite as bad, but also the good stuff wasn't quite as good. This particular book is about a Korean-American teenager named Sunny. His name is Sunny Day. His brother's name is Gray Day. Yeah, he really did go there. And Sonny has always kind of looked up to his brother, thought he was really cool. His brother is a musician. He's off playing at a bunch of different clubs in Hollywood. And all of a sudden his career tanks and he's back at home. However, in the meantime, when Gray hasn't been at home, Sonny has kind of been like using his image to impress this girl named Cirrus, who is new to town and who seems really cool and interesting and who he really wants to like him. He ends up roping his two best friends into the scheme, and they decide they're going to form a band, play music like Gray, in order to convince Cirrus that they actually were in a band together, and then they're just going to split up, and hopefully by then Cirrus will be into him. David Yoon is often compared to John Green, and I do see the comparison because you have these very intelligent teenagers that are answering these philosophical questions and sort of bumbling around, trying to find love, trying to find their place in the world. But to me, David Yoon has like this goofy side to his books that's a little bit lighter than a lot of John Green's books, and I kind of love that about his work. This book I think is even lighter than Frankly in Love. This book does still have a lot of interesting family dynamics in it. The dynamics between Gray and Sonny, the dynamics between Gray and Sonny and their parents, navigating what they want to do in the world and what kind of people they want to become. So that part I was really into. I actually think that David Yoon does family dynamics even better than he does romances. The romance in this book was fairly cute, but not really anything to write home about, in my opinion. I had seen most of this kind of thing play out before. I do have to share a couple of snippets of the writing, though. I copied these down as best as I could from the audiobook because I just thought they were so funny. For example, "You shut up, tiny weird-ass face on your mama's face's butt." Classic. "Her smile could revive crops withered by atomic fallout." That's cute. Aw. "Yes?" crooned Gunnar with the dark charm of a backstabbing, conniving court eunuch. I just love how hard that goes, like just like the sheer drama of that sentence. Overall, I think I would give this book about 3 stars. I think it is good. I just had a few too many issues with the plot not being a bit nebulous and it jumps around in places. Also, I didn't connect with all of the characters as much as I think I did in Frankly in Love. I listened to the audiobook version of this, as I said before. It was narrated by Michael Bowe, and I thought that he did a good job of bringing life to Sonny's voice, and I enjoyed his performance. Okay, this one's another retelling, and this one honestly does make me quite sad. Cinderella is Dead by Kalynn, Bayron, I think. It could be Kalynn. I was really excited to read this book. This one is another one for one of my book clubs. It's a retelling of Cinderella, in which Cinderella has been dead for 200 years and her story has become sort of like a mythology for the people in her kingdom, and young women now have to attend balls each year to find husbands. If they cannot find husbands, then they suffer a dark fate. No one is quite certain what happens to them, but it's not good. The protagonist of this book, Sophia, is a lesbian. She's in love with her female best friend, Erin, and so she has no interest in going to the ball. But she ends up having to go anyway, of course, and a series of events ensue, and she becomes acquainted with one of the descendants of Cinderella's stepsisters and realizes that there are many more versions of this story than she actually thought. I liked 2 things about this book. One is the premise, which is honestly awesome. The Cinderella story is the foundational text for a misogynist dystopia. I mean, frankly, that's brilliant. So I did really like that idea, and that idea was interesting enough that I was able to get through the book, at least. I also do like that we have a Black lesbian girl as the protagonist of this book, and that though the story does explore that she's lesbian, and that's very significant for the book, the fact that she's Black is just sort of how she is. And I do think that it's nice to have a character that is of a different race in a book that's not necessarily about racism. I think that oftentimes when we have like Black protagonists or protagonists that aren't white, people feel like the book has to be about race, and it doesn't necessarily. But that leaves what I didn't like, which is everything else. I found the plot and the world building interesting at first, but the world building is really thin. It's really only described when it's absolutely necessary for the plot, and it's never really clear how technologically advanced the society is or what kinds of things people can do for a living other than a few thinly sketched characters. Plot is pretty predictable in most spots and it jumps all over the place. The book is supposed to take place over several months, but it honestly felt like a couple of weeks. I reread parts of it and I still couldn't figure out how we were supposed to understand that Sophia has this journey of like several months. It seemed like a week or two. And the characters weren't super extraordinary to me either. Sophia is a fairly sympathetic protagonist, but that's because I think who wouldn't feel sorry for somebody in her situation? She didn't seem different from any other quote-unquote spunky, not like other girls YA protagonist. And most of the other secondary characters are even flatter than she is. I was honestly really disappointed by the execution of what actually happened to Cinderella. Without going into too much detail, what I felt like this book was trying to say in a lot of places was that these women who are effectively being treated like chattel are real people with real opinions and deserve to have their own lives and be treated like individuals, but the book itself doesn't actually do a very good job of showing us that these are individual people and distinct from each other. I felt like I didn't get to know Cinderella as a person through the exploration of her story. She kind of stayed this very mythological figure. We do learn a little bit more about her motivations and her family life, but I really wanted to know, who was Cinderella? Why should we care about her as a person? Why did the people in her life care for her? I felt that that would have made the book stronger because I think it would have brought home the point that these aren't just paper cutouts that we're dealing with. These are real people, and all of those women who are being basically sent to abusive marriages and situations are in fact real people. But every character is just so cookie cutter and basic and just about exactly what you would expect, I think, from a book of this nature, that I just wasn't surprised by anything, and I didn't have a reason to care for the book's sake rather than for the situation's sake. I'm glad that this book exists. I'm glad about the Black and lesbian representation, but just because a book has representation, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good book or that everybody has to like it. One day, I hope that representation in books such as this will be so common and widespread that it won't be a reason to necessarily think a book is good or not. We're not there yet, but I hope that someday we will get there. So for me personally, I can't give this book more than 2 stars. I honestly think I might give it a 1.5. It just fell so flat in so many ways for me. If I were 14, I think I would have really loved it, but I'm 24 and I've been around the reading block a few times and I've seen a lot of these kinds of tropes before. I'm glad other people like it, but I don't think it's for me. Last book I read this month was Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I listened to the audiobook version read by the author. This book has been on my TBR for basically as long as it's been out. Ta-Nehisi Coates is known for his work in The Atlantic, in Vanity Fair, and several other journalistic publications. He's also written some fiction and comics after this book was released. And this is his letter to his young son, who I think was an early teenager at the time, about his own experience being a Black American man and what that meant to him and how his son can navigate that experience as he grows up. He talks about his own life experiences, racial injustice in the United States, and the experiences of people that he has known. Although this book is absolutely exquisitely written, I love Ta-Nehisi Coates' way with words. I think this is some of the best writing I have read, honestly, in 2021. I think that how much you enjoy this particular book will depend a lot on sort of where you are in your journey learning about racial injustice in the United States as it pertains to Black people. If you're somebody who has been engaged with that topic for a long time and has been educating yourself, or if you're someone who this directly affects, I think that you may not find as much in this book that's totally mind-blowing as somebody who's approaching this issue for the first time. If I had read this book when it first came out, when I was a lot younger and a lot more ignorant, I think it would have totally blown my mind, and I think I would have given it easily 5 stars. But I've learned enough and grown enough since then that a lot of what Ta-Nehisi Coates was saying just wasn't new to me, although it was beautifully written. It doesn't mean it wasn't powerful. I felt that his expression of the mixture of emotions that he feels upon hearing about yet another police brutality issue, or hearing that someone he knows has been killed or affected by that. I thought those were really well done. I do feel that the narrative occasionally loses focus a bit. Coates talks a lot about his childhood, about his time at college, and although those sections weren't not enjoyable, I was interested enough in them. I didn't feel that they cohered necessarily with the overall narrative 100% of the time. However, that could be my fault for listening to the audiobook. I think with this particular book, it might have been beneficial to me to just read it rather than listen to it. I might have been able to follow it a bit better. But even though this book wasn't necessarily like that super mind-blowing thing for me, I still got a lot out of it. I think that someone who's just somebody who's maybe just learning about the issues Black people face in the US might be really interested in reading it and get a lot out of it. It's really more of like a personal perspective on this. I would still give this book 3.5 stars, and that means I think it's good. So I would give this book 3.5 stars. I think it was good, and I do think it was worth your time. Unfortunately, I think my procrastination has to come to an end, and I actually have to do my work now. Boo-hoo. But thank you for hearing me out and listening to me talk about these books when I really should be writing papers. Now I'm gonna go write them, and if you've got any papers to write, you know what? Do what you want. I really don't care, as long as you keep watching the video. Have a good week, and you'll see me sometime soon. Hopefully. Bye.